You've probably heard the phrase, "they're taking over." Maybe not out loud, maybe just a look, a comment, a meme, subtle, passive, normal. But what if that fear isn't really yours? What if it was planted there, long before you knew how to question it? Every culture has ghosts, and one of the most dangerous is the fear of the outsider. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, through pride, through tradition, through silence. You don't need to be cruel to carry it. You just need to be human, raised inside a system that taught you who belongs and who doesn't. But here's the hard truth. What you fear in others is often what you've rejected in yourself. That's not politics. That's psychology. And not just any psychology, the deep kind. Carl Jung called it projection. He believed that when we exile parts of ourselves, we end up chasing them in other people. Immigrants, strangers, neighbors. It's not about them. It's about us. About you. This video will take you to the root. Not the surface-level debates. Not the tired headlines. But the hidden stories beneath your reactions. And the myths you didn't know you were living. You'll see how purity, pride, and protection are sometimes masks for fear, shame, and unhealed identity. And by the end, if you're brave enough to look in the mirror, you might discover something most people never do. That the other you were taught to fear might just be the key to reclaiming who you really are. Sometimes we fear people we've never spoken to. A man on the subway with different clothes, a woman speaking another language at the grocery store. They trigger something deep and invisible. It's not logic. It's not reason. It's something older than both. Carl Jung called it the collective shadow, the parts of ourselves and our culture we reject, hide, and project onto others. In everyday life, this shows up in subtle reactions. Tightened jaws, sideways glances, silent judgments. For working-class people already under stress, the presence of the outsider feels like a threat to stability. But this threat isn't always real. It's emotional, symbolic, a psychic projection. Before we even ask who they are, we assign them a role. Danger, intruder, problem. But what if they're not the danger? What if it's our own unprocessed fear, masked as patriotism? People raised in hardship often grow up believing there's only enough space, money, and love for a few. This scarcity mindset feeds the fear of the other. If I'm barely surviving, how can I welcome someone else? It's a fair question. But here's the Jungian twist. This fear isn't just economic, it's archetypal. The foreigner represents the unknown self, the parts of our identity we never dared to explore. When someone speaks, dresses, or worships differently, it forces us to confront the truth. Our way is not the only way. And that's terrifying. Jung believed projection is how we avoid growth. Instead of facing our own contradictions, we push them onto someone else, often the weakest or most unfamiliar person in the room. That's how unconscious bias survives. Unnoticed, unspoken, and dangerously normal. You've seen it. The quiet discomfort when an immigrant gets hired, the angry comments online about them taking over, the casual jokes at lunch. But underneath all of that, fear. Not just of cultural change, but of identity collapse. Jung said we build masks, personas, to feel safe. But when someone walks in who doesn't reflect our image, our mask starts to crack. That crack reveals the shadow. Shame, doubt, envy, repressed curiosity. So we blame the foreigner. It's easier than questioning our history, our nation, ourself. Many working-class folks inherit this reaction. It's passed down like a myth. They're different, so be careful. But myths can lie. And Jung taught us, what we don't make conscious will rule our lives. And we'll call it fate. The tragedy is this. The foreigner often carries the exact qualities our culture has buried. Compassion, community, ritual, resilience. They threaten us not because they're wrong, but because they awaken what we've forgotten. Imagine a man who grew up learning that silence is strength. He sees a newcomer crying openly in public, not ashamed, but proud. He feels something strange, not disgust, not hatred, but envy. That's projection. That's the shadow screaming to be heard. Jungian psychology calls this a mirror moment, when the stranger reflects a part of you that never had permission to exist. This is why immigration debates are never just political. They're psychological. And if we don't recognize that, we keep turning internal pain into external war. Now, let's get honest. Most people don't sit around thinking about the cultural unconscious. They're worried about rent, job security, and whether their kids will be safe. That's exactly why the psychological roots of racism are so dangerous. They're invisible in daily life, hiding behind routines and justifications. A tired worker doesn't feel powerful. So when someone with an accent gets a spot, it can feel like one more loss in a long line of defeats. But the real enemy isn't the immigrant. It's the system that pits the poor against the poor. Jung warned us. When we ignore inner conflict, it becomes outer conflict. The solution is not blame. It's integration. And integration starts by asking, why does this person bother me so much? There's a reason fear campaigns work. They don't appeal to logic. They trigger myth. The myth of invasion. The myth of lost greatness. The myth of us versus them. These stories aren't new. They've been told for centuries. What's new is how they hide in modern language, economic risk, cultural values, national security. But underneath these terms, we find symbols. According to Jung, myths live in the cultural unconscious and shape how we see reality, without us ever realizing it. A country doesn't need to declare hate to act it out. It just needs to feed the myth. And when the myth spreads, so does the shadow. At work, at home, online. The result? Division disguised as pride, fear disguised as loyalty. Here's the twist most people miss. The foreigner is not always from another country. Sometimes, the other is just your neighbor who thinks differently, or the coworker who lives a lifestyle you secretly admire but publicly judge. The Jungian idea of the shadow goes beyond race and borders. It points to anything we deny in ourselves. And the poorer and more stressed we are, the more tempting it becomes to offload our shame onto someone else. That's not evil. That's human survival. But survival without self-awareness breeds suffering. Collective shadow work asks, what part of ourselves have we turned into an enemy? And more importantly, are we brave enough to reclaim it? Because if we don't, the cycle repeats. Suspicion, blame, dehumanization. History has shown us where that leads. But there is another path. One Jung hinted at, but rarely spelled out. Collective individuation. A culture waking up to its projections. A society brave enough to sit with discomfort, instead of attacking difference. This path begins when one person, maybe you, stops reacting and starts reflecting. When the question changes from, why are they here, to what part of me have I abandoned? And that shift, that's not just psychological, it's spiritual. It's how healing begins. But to understand how this projection turns into myth, and how myths silently govern our behavior, we need to look deeper into what really keeps cultures apart. We like to believe we live in a modern world, guided by facts, reason, and progress. But beneath every debate about immigration, culture, or identity, something far older is operating. Something older than laws, older than nations. Myths. Jung believed that myths are not just stories, they're psychic structures. They shape how we see others, how we see ourselves, and most dangerously, how we divide the world. One of the strongest myths passed down through history is the myth of purity. It whispers that there is a right kind of people, a clean culture, an original tribe that must be protected at all costs. It sounds noble, but it's a lie, because there is no pure culture, no fixed identity. Humanity has always been a story of mixing, moving, changing. Yet this myth lives on, in politics, in the news, even in our casual conversations. This myth doesn't wear armor anymore. It wears flags. It wears slogans like "protect our values" or "keep our way of life." On the surface, these phrases sound innocent, even proud. But underneath, they echo an ancient archetype: us versus them. The in-group and the out-group, the chosen and the intruders. Jung warned us that archetypes are not evil, but they are powerful. When unconscious, they possess people. They make entire populations believe that outsiders are not just different, they're dangerous. That belief becomes law, then policy, then action. And the worst part? People following these myths often feel they're doing something good, defending something sacred. That's how deep the programming goes. Myths don't ask for your approval. They just work, silently, emotionally, invisibly. For the working poor, these myths are especially tempting, not because they are weak, but because they are exhausted. When you're trying to pay rent, raise kids, and survive another week, you cling to anything that gives you identity, pride, and control. The myth of us gives meaning. It makes people feel seen, like they belong to something. But every myth has a cost, and the cost here is division. The myth of purity doesn't just exclude the foreigner, it poisons the community. It creates suspicion between neighbors. It rewards conformity and punishes difference. And in time, it turns the tribe against itself. That's the tragedy Jung saw coming, a culture so obsessed with defending itself that it forgets how to evolve. And still, it persists. You hear it at family dinners. You see it in online comment sections. You feel it at the edge of every immigration debate. This invisible force that says, "We were better before." Better when? No one can say. Because the past being defended never really existed. It's nostalgia wrapped in mythology, a collective hallucination. And it's used to justify exclusion, borders, and moral superiority. Jung said we project our shadows not just onto individuals, but onto entire groups. When a society represses its fears, its doubts, its shame, it finds a scapegoat. The myth justifies it. The archetype fuels it. And soon people stop seeing humans. They only see symbols, enemies, invaders. But let's make it real. Think about how this shows up in everyday life. A mother from another country signs her child up at your kid's school, and suddenly people whisper. A man opens a food truck with unfamiliar spices, and someone calls it weird or too much. A foreign-sounding name applies for a job, and someone says, he won't fit the culture. These are not random moments. They are echoes of the myth, the archetype playing out through ordinary people. And if we're honest, most of us have participated in it at some point, even unconsciously. That's not cause for shame. It's a call to wake up, because what's unconscious will always find a way to act, with or without our permission. So how do we break the spell? Not by shouting or canceling, but by naming. Jung taught that the first step to freedom is to recognize the archetype, to look the myth in the eye and say, "I see you," and then to trace it. Where did I learn this idea? Who told me purity was real? What does it protect me from? These questions matter, because they pull the myth from the shadow into the light. And once in the light, it loses its grip. That's how transformation begins. Not through external war, but internal reckoning. And when enough individuals do this work, culture shifts. The myth no longer owns us. We start owning ourselves. There's another layer. These myths don't just distort how we see others. They distort how we see ourselves. If you've ever felt like you had to hide part of your heritage, your history, or your personality to fit in, then you've already suffered under the myth. Purity doesn't just exclude immigrants, it silences locals too. It says, only this version of you is acceptable. That's why so many people feel fake, disconnected, performative. They're playing a role written by a myth they never chose. Jung called this a betrayal of the self, and it leads to depression, anxiety, resentment. The only cure is authenticity, and authenticity starts where the myth ends. So we ask, who would you be without the myth? What would your community look like without this invisible wall? Who might become your friend, your teacher, your partner, if you weren't taught to fear them? The truth is, no one benefits from this division, except those who profit from fear. And fear only survives where myth is mistaken for fact. But when a culture begins to see through the story, to rewrite it, that's when healing begins. And to rewrite a myth, we must understand what projection does to our perception of reality. That's where we're heading next. Most people don't think they're part of the problem. I'm not racist, they say. I treat everyone the same. But in Jungian psychology, the real danger isn't in conscious hatred. It's in unconscious projection. That silent habit of placing our own unresolved issues onto someone else. We think we're being neutral, but neutrality in a system built on fear becomes complicity. The truth is, collective healing doesn't start with policies or protests. It starts with the courage to look inside. What part of myself have I banished? What group of people have I secretly judged or feared? These questions aren't easy, but they're necessary. Because as long as we keep projecting our shadows outward, we will continue to recreate the same enemies, the same conflicts, the same pain, generation after generation. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole by integrating what we've disowned. Individuation isn't some spiritual luxury for philosophers and monks. It's a survival tool, especially for the working class, especially for the emotionally exhausted. When a culture refuses to reflect, it turns its suffering into blame. And that blame needs a target. Immigrants, outsiders, people who are different. But the pain never really goes away, because it was never about them. It was always about us, about what we fear, what we've lost, what we're ashamed of. That's the painful irony. Projection feels like defense, but it's actually self-destruction in disguise. The more we project, the less we grow. And the less we grow, the more we fear. Think about the daily stress most people carry. Low wages, long hours, family pressure, social rejection. Now imagine adding to that the unconscious weight of ancestral trauma, cultural shame, and generational myths. It's overwhelming. That's why so many people default to survival mode, clinging to identity, clinging to tribe. It feels safer, but it's a trap. Because the world is changing whether we like it or not. New faces, new stories, new ways of being are arriving at our doorsteps. And if we keep responding with projection instead of reflection, we will remain stuck in a loop of fear and division. Healing begins when we realize that no one is coming to steal our identity. They're coming to challenge it, to expand it, and maybe even to complete it. Individuation asks something radical, that we become curious instead of defensive, that we stop reacting and start witnessing, not just others, but ourselves. Why did I tense up when that person walked in? Why do I feel irritated when I hear that accent? What story am I telling myself about them? And where did that story come from? These questions open a portal. They take us from unconscious bias to conscious choice, from inherited myth to personal truth. And that shift isn't just intellectual, it's emotional, spiritual. It reclaims power. Because projection steals your agency. It makes you a puppet of old pain. But reflection gives it back. It makes you responsible, yes, but also free. Some people resist this path. It's too abstract, they say. Too soft. But let's be clear. Individuation is not weakness. It's war. A war against internal ignorance, against generations of silence, against the easy lie of blaming others. The person who chooses to confront their projections is doing sacred work, not just for themselves, but for their family, their children, their culture. Jung believed that every act of inner work ripples outward. One integrated person can shift a household, a neighborhood, a nation. But we have to be willing to face discomfort, to admit we've been wrong, to stop clinging to purity and start embracing complexity. That's where true belonging lives, not in sameness, but in integration. Let's bring this down to earth. Imagine a man who grew up hearing that foreigners were lazy, dangerous, or untrustworthy. One day he's paired with an immigrant coworker. They work side by side, eat lunch together, share stories, and something shifts. The myth cracks. The projection collapses. For the first time, the other becomes human. That's individuation in action. Not in a psychology book, not in a lecture, but in real life. And the more this happens, the more resilient a culture becomes. Because a culture that has integrated its shadow is not afraid of difference. It's curious, compassionate, creative. That's the future waiting for us, if we're willing to do the inner work now. Still, this isn't a one-time fix. The shadow doesn't disappear. It evolves. It hides in new places. It wears new clothes. That's why individuation is a lifelong process. It requires vigilance, humility, and community. You can't do it alone, because the projections we hold often come from the people around us. That's why collective individuation matters. When groups, families, and nations begin to reflect together, something powerful happens. Old narratives lose their grip. New stories emerge. And slowly, the cultural unconscious begins to heal. Not through erasure, but through integration. Not through shame, but through truth. So ask yourself this: what part of the world have I rejected because I was taught to? What part of myself have I exiled because it didn't fit the myth? The foreigner outside is just a symbol, a mirror, a messenger. The real journey is inward, toward the parts of yourself you were told to fear. And when you begin to reclaim those parts, the fear dissolves, the cycle breaks, and something new is born. But for that to happen, we have to name the myth. We have to confront the projection. And we have to step into a future where no one needs to be the enemy just to feel like they belong. So now you know, the fear wasn't random. It was inherited. It was rehearsed. And it was never truly about the other. It was always about you, your unspoken doubts, your silenced questions, the parts of yourself you were taught to hide. But what will you do with that knowledge? Will you keep projecting those fears onto strangers? Or will you turn inward and start the real work? Will you keep defending myths, or begin rewriting them? This isn't about guilt. It's about power. The power to choose your beliefs instead of recycling someone else's. The power to question, to unlearn, to see clearly. Because clarity is freedom, and freedom is contagious. So here's your challenge. The next time you feel discomfort around someone different, pause. Don't react, reflect. Ask yourself, what story am I living? And is it even mine? That question alone can begin to break the cycle, for you, and maybe for those around you too. If this video spoke to something deep inside you, something quiet but true, then subscribe now, turn on notifications, because we're not done. This is just one layer of the unconscious world you live in every day. And in the next videos, we'll keep going deeper. Into the myths you didn't know you were trapped in, and the power you didn't know you had to break free. You're not here to stay the same. You're here to wake up.